you've spent probably as long as anyone looking at weirdness, altered states, and the kind of the people who navigated that in the 60s and 70s. Who do you think are the key people to pay attention to? And what do you think are the best tips for kind of navigating this space that we're in now?
Well, it's funny. I started out really just being interested in the problem of how do individuals deal with these extraordinary, bizarre experiences that are sort of equally composed of psychosis and religion. And in kind of looking at what they were doing, I felt like I figured out some navigational tips that weirdly seem to apply to much more things than I thought I was talking about initially. And one of those things is what I call the tightrope walk. And so in all three of the cases that I was looking at in high weirdness, Philip Gay Dick, Terence McKenna, and Robert Anton Wilson, they're all having these bizarre experiences, not always from the same time. Two of them took a lot of psychedelics. Dick didn't take too much psychedelics. He was more of a natural. But in any case, they were spending a lot of time in these visionary worlds with paranoid implications and loads of synchronicities. And, they were really getting out on the edge. But unlike a lot of people who are either typical paranoids or religious visionaries, they also kind of resisted what they were experiencing. And they did it partly through humor, and they did it partly through skepticism. And this is, to me, one of the really important transformations that happens with psychedelic experience, is that up to psychedelic experience, most people who have visionary experiences that don't just become completely crazy, they tend to really believe them. That's kind of the history of religion, is you have like this extraordinary experience and you're like, I had this experience. I was talking to an angel. He gave me a book. Let's go for it. And whether it's, people in, the 19th century or back in the ancient world. But psychedelics introduce a new thing in the equation, which is that you can have an extraordinary visionary experience with religious implications, apocalyptic implications, messianic implications. I see the world. And then you wake up the next day and you go, whoa, what was that? And you kind of almost have a choice. Do you hold on to that visionary conviction? Or do you go, okay, something more is going on here? Or that has to also be integrated into this? Or what do we do? What do we do with this? And that was part of my question, is what do we do with this? So I was interested in the way that these guys also resisted it. And it has to do with this quality of skepticism and with what I would call ordinary reason. And I like to distinguish reason from rationality. Like, to me, the way I'm using it right here, right now, rationality is kind of like an attempt to support and understand these large systems of explanations that can account for a greater and greater percentage of reality. So you're like, I'm into whatever, it's mathematics, it's logical relations, these large systems that help us understand the world. And I'm not saying that those systems aren't groovy, but that's not what I'm talking about. By reason, I mean something that's a little bit more close to home. It's like, is this going to be good for me? Is it not going to be good for me? What if I do that? It's going to be this. And it's like, I feel this about this person, but I don't really trust it. I think I might be running one of my own trips. That kind of sense of bringing a skeptical quality to your own experience as a way to help you navigate through life better. And that quality these guys all had in really interesting ways. Not all the time. Sometimes they lost the plot. But a lot of time they were able to go through these extremely bizarre experiences, but kind of keep their feet on the ground. And the metaphor I came up with this that I think is actually very helpful for us is this idea of being on a tightrope. You're no longer on solid ground. In some sense, your own responses create the gravity that allows you not to fall. And you've got this nice instrument, and the instrument is kind of like ordinary reason. It's like, well, it might be this. Well, I don't know about that. That's a little bit much. And so you kind of keep your own interior balance of awareness. Your eyes are open. You're responding to all the shifts of the situation you're in. You've got your hands on some of the stuff you really know, things about psychology, things about, how the mind processes things, certain skeptical ideas about over believing our own experiences, a certain quality of kind of organic skepticism. And then with all that, you can go farther and farther and farther into the screaming void. And that is a kind of, that's a good handy tip for far out voyaging in psychedelics. It's a handy tip for when you're losing the plot for whatever reason, synchronicities, crazy stuff in your life, terrible grief, when you start to kind of really lose connection with things and you're like, oh, here we go. There's still these threads of a certain kind of, okay, now I'm on the tightrope. Now I gotta like try to do my best I can. Sometimes you fall, but then you get to get it back up most of the time. And I really think that this was something that these guys were kind of exploring. And another analogy for it that you get in Robert Anton Wilson that I also think is really applicable to today, to aspects of today, particularly if you're thinking about conspiracy theory and how easily it is for people to get absorbed into conspiracy narratives today, which is a fascinating thing. It's for me, trying to grapple with conspiracy theory today. And I admit that the term conspiracy theory is problematic and we have to historicize it. And it doesn't mean there aren't conspiracies, blah, 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 blah. It's always important to say these things because there's a lot of mainstream talk about conspiracy theory that's really pretty stupid. But for me to really grapple with it in its complexity is not just like a sidelight. It's not like, oh yeah, all the deplorables over here are getting into conspiracy theory and all the smart people are trying to keep the ship going. It's not like that. It's much more symptomatic and it's much more central, I think, as a sign of what's happening with media, with consensus reality, with the narrative wars, with weaponized multi-layered narratives where certain narratives are put forward to because they feed these other narratives that are being controlled from a third position. All of those scary, spy movie, psychedelic paranoia kinds of zones, that's just part of the fabric of reality now. So we got to get good at navigating this stuff and not just trying to put it in a box. And Wilson was pretty good at navigating this stuff. You could critique him in some ways. In some ways, he was probably a little bit, he probably played with the gullible a little bit more than he should have. But, in any case, he was definitely someone who was trying to walk with his tightrope, walk as a tightrope walker into these realms. And one thing he talked about was this place that people find themselves in called Chapel Perilous. And what Chapel Perilous was, it's from the Grail myths, but in Wilson's interpretation, it's basically a place where you've been following these strange lines of implication, you going down rabbit holes in the internet, or the earlier forms of archives, or your own psychedelic experience, or your own dream life and synchronicities, and everything starting to connect. And then you find yourself in this place where you can't go back. You're like, oh, the door's shut behind me. I can't just go, oh, this is all a bit much. I'm just going to return to my ordinary life because the implications are too much. The narrative has swallowed you up. And he says, like, when you're in Chapel Perilous, there's only two ways out. You either come out a stone cold paranoid or you come out a radical agnostic. And there's a lot of wisdom in that. And because radical agnostic, if we want to avoid the stone cold paranoid, which unfortunately it feels like a lot of people aren't, then we have to move. You can't go back. You have to go forward. And what does that mean? That means even more skepticism. The problem, one of the main problems that a lot of conspiracy theory people go through, it's something that a writer on the net described as freshman skepticism, which is that you learn the first stage of radical skepticism about the narratives you've gotten, the media, the stories. It's like, who says we're on a three-dimensional ball floating through the earth? Like, maybe these guys have been lying to us all the time. So you learn the real power of skepticism, which is it's like an acid. It just eats through everything. And you use it just enough to pull away from a consensus view. And then where are you? Well, then you're like locked into some weird internet subculture, long tail echo chamber. And then you're like, yeah, I'm home. I found my tribe. And you find these people and they just iterate the same stuff you've heard from the guy next to them. So they haven't freed themselves from collective narratives, from collective stories, a lot of them. They just get away from the first layer and get stuck in the second. But the radical agnostic goes, well, why should I trust this weird guy over here and with his videos? Why do I trust these conspiracy narratives? Why do I trust my own fear? And so there's a way of going deeper and deeper and deeper into skepticism where you pop out and you're like, okay, I really can't really ground any of my beliefs. I can see the way that mathematics has these self-contradictory elements to them. I can see the way that, you know, physics is contradictory in all sorts of ways. And which physics are we talking about? And will there ever be one physics? Unlikely. You realize how multiplicitous, how chaotic, how multidimensional the world is, but you're okay with that because you're kind of back. You're back with a difference. You're back with like, well, but I'm in this condition where I'm making decisions, I'm building models of the world, I'm talking to people that I can resonate with, and we're helping each other clarify how we get through that. You know, science can give us a lot of information about what's going on, but you hold everything more lightly. You hold everything sort of gingerly, and you're aware that it can go south or turn under, or the rug can be pulled out from under you at any time, so that when that happens, you're not terrified. You don't lose the plot. You're like, oh, it's the crazy part again. Or, oh, now I'm paranoid today. Yeah, it's all coming together. Okay, well, let's try to navigate this, be nice to people, don't hurt myself. You know, in a weird way, it comes back to being very pragmatic and very realistic, but you're not clinging onto these totalizing narratives anymore. And that's where people get stuck, because that's scary. I mean, it's scary to believe that Bill Gates is making a vaccine that he's gonna force us all to take, and it's got a microchip and they're gonna control us. Yeah, that's pretty scary. It's like a weird fiction, or I love weird fiction. I love horror. I love science fiction. You know, it's another one of those, and it's scary if you think it's true. But it's a lot scarier to go, in some ways, the world is a chaos that nobody knows is really going on. Nobody knows. And if you think that there's a captain of the ship and you finally get there and you get into the captain's chamber, it's empty. There's just committees and fights and negotiations and different models. And that's us riding history, riding this flowing chaos of a wave. And there you are waking up to it, you know, having ultimate responsibility, but also realizing you don't know what's going on. And that's a very psychedelic moment. And then there's the next day. How are you going to live with that? Well, get out of Chapel Perilous, man. Get into, like, if that's the way you've gone, embrace radical agnosticism, embrace not knowing, but not a one that disenables you from making decisions. It's a paradox in a way, but not totally. And it's, to my mind, a very, it's like a mature psychedelia, or a mature kind of skepticism, where you're going for it, but you don't stop from you know, taking it all the way down and then having to come back, because there you are, you're still making decisions. Do I do this? Do I do that? You can't just say, I don't know, it's all fake or whatever. It doesn't work. So that's my hope, you know, and it's not for everybody. It's just for people, I think, who find themselves going in these weird ways that, as I said with conspiracy theory, are now just part of mediated reality. So you have people who have no psychedelic experience, who don't think about these ways, who don't know the history of conspiracy theory, just tuning into this stuff and really getting lost really fast. And I know people personally. I've seen a lot of people in the New Age world and the yoga world and the psychedelic world, Burning Man world, all these worlds that I'm kind of part in and part out, just lose the plot, get absorbed into narratives that are being manipulated by other levels of narrative and other players for very specific reasons. So it's a time for some of these tools to spread.
Yeah. It's really interesting. I mean, we did a whole series on conspiracy, so I kind of looked into it. And there's something, it is very psychoactive. The whole area of conspiracy theory is very psychoactive. And one of the best summaries of why that is came from a friend of mine who says that it's a lot of it is very archetypal material.
Absolutely.
We're moving into like mythopoetic realms. And if you're not careful, at some point you actually start chasing Satan. Like there's all of these kind of really deep religious archetypes. And for example, like projecting Satan onto Bill Gates, classic one that you sort of see people doing constantly online. But at the same time, you can't reject it wholesale either, because a friend of mine also said that there's some, in some sense, becoming a conspiracy theorist is probably a necessary initiation for all of us. Like
I
once we let go of consensus reality, going through that process is almost like a necessary initiation now.
I think that's really true. Another thing that reminds me of is what one of the things I was trying to do in high weirdness when I was looking at all the stories and visions and books that these psychonauts had come up with, is to take them seriously, but not take them literally. And the instinctive mainstream response to conspiracy is to not take it literally or seriously. Or you go over to the other side and you take it seriously and you take it literally. And then a lot of things have been set up. So it's one of those, in a way, it's another aspect of this practice of agnosticism where I go into it and I go, no, there's something here. What is it? What is that for? And part of it, I think, is a revelation of these archetypal narratives, these unconscious fears and phantasms like Satan, like the end of the world, like the saved remnant. And a lot of them, by the way, are Christian. And I think that part of the problem with conspiracy theory is that, how to say this, is that it initiates you into a kind of realm of the imaginal that, again, we have to take seriously, that it's not just fantasies or dream patterns in some dusty book, that like the imaginal is no joke. It's part of our world. It's part of who we are. And you get in there and you're like, whoa, what's going on here? And there are certain patterns that humans have used to kind of organize it. And the Christian one has a certain, has some features of it that make it attractive. And one of those is that it's very clear. There's a good and an evil, and I'm on the good side. And then that gives me a purpose in life, which is to spread the message of good and evil. So now I'm going to propagate the conspiracy theory. And it's all in relationship to a moment in the near future where everything is going to come apart, or it's all going to be revealed. In UFO stuff, they talk about disclosure. And UFO folks have been talking about disclosure for decades, and we get little bits of it. It's the authorities even play with it. They give you, the Air Force gives you a few bits, and you're like, that's it. Disclosure is just around the corner. But it's a pattern, it's a way of organizing history that's very rooted in a kind of Christian way of looking at it. I prefer a more shamanic view of the imaginal world. And I think that is a more mature, psychedelically informed kind of view. And that's one in which you're like, welcome to a world with many ambiguous players. What looks like evil may not be so evil. What looks like good may not be so good. And you and yours have to kind of navigate this through alliances and practices and your own sort of autonomous ability to navigate that zone, rather than joining the army of the good against the army of the devil. And so that's, I think, a dimension that's going on with this idea that you're talking about as a kind of initiation, but in a more grounded way. I would also say that the way that a lot of conspiracy theories are true is that they are, let's call them allegories for real conditions of real power, whose implications are both harrowing enough and difficult enough to pin down that you can't really get there through conventional means of journalism, investigative journalism, academic study, It sort of eludes that. So that, the degree to which psychopharmacology and the corporations that make pill, like that, they maintain such a massive influence over media, over our self-image, over our medicine, the very things we take into our bodies. From a alien anthropologist point of view, it's this totally weird, dark white coated shamanism that works but doesn't work. And I mean, it's so vast that you can't really get there with just like, even if you follow like the OxyContin trail and go, how did we end up like addicting millions of Americans with these powerful drugs that we knew were bad? Like, how does that happen? And you can go through as an investigative journalist and track, okay, this family, these guys made this decision. Here's this regulatory agency. Here are these lobbyists, blah, blah, blah. And you get this kind of murky story that never really ends and hardly anybody ever takes responsibility for it. And that may be the best we can do with that medium. But on another level, the horror of that, where are you going to put that? You put it in the imagination. And so then when you get a Bill Gates vaccine microchip story, you're like, the affect, the emotional energy that is animating that story, that's true. Or it's responsive to a real situation. And that's another thing that I recommend people who are going through this realm, is to become very good at picking apart the affect or the emotion from the narrative. And that this is true of you too. Like when something seems exciting or seems attractive, seems to be true, what is it pulling out of you emotionally? Not the story, emotionally. Because a lot of the manipulation, a lot of the narrative manipulation that we see, it has to do with figuring out which of many stories are best able to trigger and capture these emotions, which most of us aren't as aware of, which are sometimes very powerful: fear, dread, lust, resentment, bitterness, hatred. I mean, powerful stuff. We are like crazy animals. And if you get the right narrative, oh, I've got it, and I learned this listening to a lot of right-wing radio back in the day, kind of before, well, I mean, it continues on in its glories, but this was like, 20, 30 years ago when it was really just sort of bubbling up. And it was always so interesting because you could just hear the way the host was sort of like retelling a story about like immigrants. Okay, the immigrants, they come in here and da-da-da. Oh wait, ding, now you're getting all these calls. God damn, these people, they're da-da-da. And you realize that it's not actually about the language or the concepts or the political models. It's about bitterness and resentment and powerlessness and fear, and stirring that stuff up and getting it to stick on certain narratives. And that's how a lot of narrative control happens. And so that also gives you a way of appreciating what's going on with conspiracy theory, because a lot of the emotions are really heavy. They're really dark. It is not an accident. It's very important to understand that at the heart of QAnon, which is this vast, influential, right-wing Trump, pro-Trump, I don't even call it right-wing, I'll call it Trump conspiracy theory, that actually has, people who believe it are running for office for in the federal government right now as we speak in the United States, that at the heart of this is in some ways the worst thing that any of us can imagine: the ritualized sexual abuse of children. Horrible, impossible to think about without this murky slime of feeling arising. And it's so easy to weaponize. Anger, self-justification. That's it. That's my line in the sand. All of those emotions that come up out of the horror of that reality. And unfortunately, it is a reality. It's part of our human darkness, which we've never gotten out of and we're unlikely to ever get out of. But it's not an excuse, but it's just part of it. But it's focused in there because of the way that generates so much affect and energy and emotion. So to go into that seriously but not literal world is also a kind of process of your own like emotional risk, because you got to kind of get close to a lot of things that are very difficult, you know. And so it's hard stuff, but I think it's also really key, because you're right. Once you fall away from the mainstream story and you start to go, whoa, we're not in Kansas anymore, inevitably those narratives, some of which have things that are true in them, some of which are even largely true, as at least allegorically, they're right there waiting for you with all those people and all that self-reinforcing kind of counter narrative ready to absorb you. And if you want to stay sovereign, in the sense that I know that you know, Rebel Wisdom is partly about, that sense of being an autonomous thinker who's moving through these realms that we don't really have a good guide for, then it's really important to be aware and process that spiritual, emotional level and recognize what's going on in other people, because it's sort of like the main story, even though it doesn't necessarily look like it.
We've
Sure.
got to keep alert to what's going on and do the work.
Yeah, just to keep on that, keep alert to what's going on, but that your own emotions are not secondary to that process. And indeed, we're being asked to become more clear about our own emotional processing, because that's part of both the way we get captured, and it's also part of the way that we step forward and move forward with more coherence and light.